September 1942. A foggy morning in Falmouth, England. Inside a cramped postal office, a 17-year-old girl named Peggy Thornton sorted letters for a living. Love letters from soldiers, bills, government notices, nothing exciting, nothing important, or so everyone thought. One morning, Peggy noticed something strange. A postage stamp looked wrong. The king's face sat slightly off-center. The color was a shade too dark. The tiny holes along the edge were spaced differently than usual. Her co-worker laughed. "All stamps look the same to me," she said. "You were imagining things." But Peggy was not imagining things. That one silly observation, dismissed by everyone around her, would expose a hidden German spy network operating right under Britain's nose. It would lead to the capture of 11 enemy operatives. It would save an entire convoy of ships from waiting U-boats. And it would change how British intelligence fought its secret war forever. All because a teenage girl trusted her own eyes when nobody else did. How did a postal clerk with no training outsmart professional spies? What did she see that trained intelligence officers missed for months? And why did the government hide her story for decades? Stay with me until the end. This story will surprise you. If you love untold stories from history, hit that subscribe button right now. It helps this channel grow and brings you more incredible tales like this one. Drop a comment telling me where you are watching from. I love reading every single one. Now let us go back to that foggy September morning and discover how one girl's curiosity changed history. The postal sorting facility in Falmouth was not the kind of place where history was made. It was a 2-story brick building that had served various purposes over the decades before the Royal Mail took it over in 1928. The sorting room filled most of the ground floor. High windows let in the grey Cornish light. Wooden tables stood in neat rows, and always there was the constant rustle of paper as workers moved letters from bag to slot to bag. Again, 12 workers processed mail here for the town and surrounding villages. It was quiet work, repetitive work, the kind of work that made hours stretch like warm taffy on a summer afternoon. Among these 12 workers was Margaret Thornton. Everyone called her Peggy. She was 17 years old with sharp eyes and a habit of noticing things that others missed. She had taken this job exactly 3 months earlier, not because she dreamed of sorting letters, but because her family needed the money. Her father, Harold Thornton, had shipped out with the Royal Navy. He was a career petty officer with 22 years of service. With him gone, her mother struggled to pay rent on their small cottage near the waterfront. So Peggy sorted mail. She checked postage for accuracy. She flagged items that seemed improperly addressed or lacked sufficient stamps. Simple tasks, boring tasks. But Peggy had a gift for making boring things interesting. Her primary school teachers had called her observant to a fault. Her reports always mentioned her tendency to spot things others overlooked, a misspelled word on the blackboard, a pattern in how birds gathered on telephone wires. Her father had encouraged this trait since she was small. During his leaves, he would play observation games with her. He would ask her to memorize details of rooms they visited and recall them later. He called it training her brain to be useful. He could never have imagined just how useful it would become. The supervisor of the facility was a portly man named Gerald Whitmore. He had worked for the Royal Mail for 31 years. He ran the office with a mixture of tired routine and wartime worry. He had lived through 2 major conflicts now. He understood that every letter passing through their hands might carry news of a loved one's fate. That weight hung over the sorting room like the fog that never seemed to lift from the harbour outside. Peggy's colleague at the next sorting station was Dorothy Finch, a middle-aged woman with 15 years of postal experience. Dorothy was practical and efficient. She did not waste time wondering about things that did not concern her. But Peggy wondered. She wondered about everything. She began noticing the handwriting styles of regular correspondents. She could identify certain letter writers by how they formed their lowercase letters. She even started predicting which envelopes contained good news versus bad news, based on subtle clues she could not quite explain. The weight of the paper, the pressure of the pen strokes, whether addresses were centered or slightly crooked. These details told Peggy stories that remained invisible to everyone around her. It was during the second week of September that Peggy first noticed something truly odd. A letter addressed to a Mrs. Constance Peaton in the village of Mornan Smith bore a stamp that looked wrong. The king's profile seemed a fraction off-center. The perforations along the edge were spaced differently than usual, and the color, it was perhaps a shade too dark. Just a shade, nothing dramatic, nothing obvious. Peggy held the envelope up to the light from the window. She turned it this way and that, trying to understand what was bothering her. "That is peculiar," she said quietly to herself. Dorothy glanced over with mild curiosity. "What have you got there, dear?" Peggy showed her the envelope. She explained that the stamp looked wrong somehow. She could not put her finger on it exactly, but something about it was simply not right. Dorothy squinted at the stamp for a moment, then she shrugged and returned to her own pile of letters. "You are imagining things," Dorothy said. "All stamps look the same to me. Just sort it and move on. We have 3 more bags to get through before lunch." Peggy did sort it, but she did not move on. Instead, she opened her personal notebook, a small book she kept for tracking interesting observations, and made a note in the margin. She wrote the date. She wrote the recipient's name. She wrote a brief description of what had seemed unusual about the stamp. She did not know why she did it. It just felt important somehow. The paradox was striking, though Peggy could not see it yet. Trained intelligence officers across Britain were hunting for spies using radio detection equipment, surveillance networks, and interrogation techniques refined over years. They were looking for coded messages in newspapers, secret meetings in dark alleys, and suspicious foreigners with thick accents. They never thought to look at postage stamps. They never imagined that the crack in Germany's carefully built espionage network would be spotted by a teenage girl in a foggy coastal town who simply refused to believe that all stamps looked the same. But one stamp was not enough. One oddity could be a printing error. One discrepancy could be a trick of the light. What Peggy needed was a pattern, and over the following days, as more letters passed through her hands, she would find exactly that. Over the following 2 weeks, Peggy encountered 4 more letters that triggered the same uneasy feeling. Each time, the sensation was identical. Something about the stamp was not quite right. The wrongness was subtle, so subtle that most people would never notice it. But Peggy noticed. The second letter was addressed to a Mr. Howard Green in the village of Penryn. The third went to a Miss Adelaide Foster in Myler Bridge. The fourth and fifth were sent to addresses in nearby hamlets, whose names Peggy had barely heard before taking this job. 5 letters in total now. 5 stamps that shared the same quiet strangeness. Peggy recorded each one carefully in her notebook. She wrote the date each letter passed through her hands. She wrote the recipient's name and village. She noted the return addresses, which were scattered across different parts of England. London, Birmingham, Manchester, Bristol. She described the handwriting on each envelope, whether it slanted left or right, whether the letters were large or cramped. She even noted the weight of the paper, heavy or thin, rough or smooth. The recipients seemed to have nothing in common. They lived in different villages. Their names suggested no family connection. The return addresses pointed to strangers in distant cities who had no obvious reason to write to quiet Cornish villages. Yet something tied these 5 letters together. Peggy could almost see the connection, like a shape moving just beneath the surface of dark water. But she could not quite grasp it. Her colleagues noticed nothing unusual. Dorothy Finch continued to sort her piles without a second glance at any stamp. Gerald Whitmore remained in his office, reviewing reports and making telephone calls about delayed shipments. The other workers chatted about rationing, complained about the weather, and counted the hours until their shifts ended. Only Peggy saw the pattern forming. Only she felt the weight of it growing heavier each day. On the evening of September 28th, Peggy sat at the kitchen table in her family's cottage. Her notebook lay open before her, filled with her careful observations. The cottage was small but comfortable. Whitewashed walls reflected the soft lamplight. From the front window, you could see the harbour where fishing boats rocked gently against their moorings. Peggy had lived in this cottage her entire life. She knew every creak of the floorboards. She knew every draught that slipped through the window frames on cold nights. But tonight, the familiar surroundings felt different somehow. The air seemed charged with possibility, though she could not explain why. Her mother, Ellen Thornton, prepared a modest dinner at the stove, vegetable soup and the last of their weekly bread ration. The smell of boiling carrots and potatoes filled the small kitchen. Ellen was a practical woman. Before the war, she had worked as a seamstress. Now she split her time between the cottage and the local hospital, where she volunteered 3 days each week, helping nurses care for wounded soldiers. Ellen noticed her daughter's intense concentration. The girl had barely looked up from her notebook in 20 minutes. "What are you puzzling over so intently?" Ellen asked, setting down her ladle. Peggy explained about the stamps. She described how they all looked slightly wrong in the same way. She admitted that she could not figure out why, but she knew something was not right. She expected her mother to dismiss her concerns, just as Dorothy had done. She expected to hear that she was being fanciful, that she was imagining patterns where none existed. Instead, Ellen came to the table and studied Peggy's notes for a long moment. Her brow furrowed in thought. The kitchen fell silent except for the soft bubbling of soup on the stove. Then Ellen said something that changed everything. "My mother was a postmistress in Cornwall for 23 years before the last war," Ellen said slowly. "She told me once that during times of conflict, intelligence services from various countries sometimes used the postal system to send coded messages. They would use counterfeit stamps because real stamps could be traced back to specific post offices where they were purchased." Peggy stared at her mother. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. "Are you saying these might be counterfeit stamps?" Peggy asked. "That someone might be using them to send secret messages?" Ellen shrugged and returned to her soup. "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm only sharing what my mother told me years ago." She paused, stirring the pot thoughtfully. "But if you truly believe something is wrong, perhaps you should mention it to someone who might know better." That night, Peggy lay awake in her small bedroom. She listened to the distant sound of waves breaking against the harbour wall. The rhythm was familiar, soothing, unchanged since her childhood, but her thoughts were anything but calm. The idea seemed outlandish. It belonged in adventure novels and cinema reels, not in the life of a 17-year-old postal clerk. Spies, counterfeit stamps, secret messages hidden in ordinary mail. These were fantasies, surely, things that happened to other people in other places, but she could not shake the feeling that she had stumbled onto something real, something important, something dangerous. This was the paradox that kept her awake. She was nobody special. She had no training, no expertise, no connections to power. She was just a girl who noticed things. Yet her observations might matter more than all the work of trained professionals who had never thought to examine a postage stamp closely. By morning, Peggy had made her decision. She would speak to Gerald Whitmore. She would show him what she had found, and whatever happened next, she would know that she had trusted her own eyes when everyone else told her she was imagining things. The sorting room awaited, but first there was a conversation that needed to happen behind a closed office door. Peggy arrived at the postal sorting facility 30 minutes before her shift began. The early morning air was cold and damp. Fog hung thick over the harbour, muffling all sound except the cry of gulls circling above the fishing boats. The streets were nearly empty. Most of Falmouth still slept. Inside the building, the sorting room stood quiet and shadowed. The only person present was the night watchman finishing his rounds. His footsteps echoed on the wooden floor as he moved between the rows of sorting tables, checking windows and locking doors before heading home. Peggy found Gerald Whitmore in his office, exactly as she had hoped. He sat at his desk reviewing the previous day's sorting reports. His expression carried its usual look of mild displeasure mixed with exhaustion. Junior clerks rarely sought him out voluntarily, so when Peggy knocked on his doorframe, he glanced up with surprise. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore," Peggy said. Her voice was steady, though her heart pounded hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. "I apologize for bothering you so early, but I have noticed something strange with some of the stamps coming through. Would you mind taking a look?" Whitmore's first instinct was dismissal. He had worked for the Royal Mail since before this girl was born. He had sorted millions of letters. He knew stamps better than he knew his own children's faces. What could a teenage clerk possibly show him that he had not seen 1,000 times before? But something in Peggy's earnest expression gave him pause. He gestured for her to come in and show him what she had found. Peggy stepped into the office. The air smelled of old paper, pipe tobacco, and the faint mustiness of filing cabinets that had not been opened in years. She produced 5 envelopes from the pocket of her coat. She had quietly retrieved them from the outgoing mail before they could be delivered. This was technically against regulations, a serious violation in fact. It could cost her the job she desperately needed. She knew the risk she was taking by admitting what she had done, but the importance of what she had discovered outweighed the fear of losing her position. Whitmore took the first envelope. He held it up to his desk lamp, examining the stamp closely. His thick fingers ran along the perforations at the edge. He set it down and picked up the second envelope, then the third, then the fourth and fifth. His expression changed as he examined each one. Skepticism gave way to curiosity. Curiosity deepened into something that looked almost like alarm. The office fell silent except for the ticking of the wall clock and the distant sound of cartwheels rattling over cobblestones outside. "Where did you get these?" Whitmore asked finally. His voice was quiet but sharp. Peggy explained. All 5 letters had come through the regular mail over the past 2 weeks. They were addressed to different people in different villages. She had flagged them because the stamps looked wrong in ways she could not fully explain, but the wrongness was consistent across all 5. Whitmore was silent for a long moment. His fingers drummed on the desk surface, a nervous habit Peggy had never seen him display before. "Wait here," he said abruptly. He rose and left the office, closing the door behind him. Through the frosted glass, Peggy saw him walk to the front desk where the facility's single telephone sat. She heard him ask the operator to connect him to a London exchange. The number he gave meant nothing to her. When the call connected, his voice dropped so low that she could not make out his words. But she could hear the tension in his tone, the urgency. 20 minutes passed. Peggy sat in the hard wooden chair across from Whitmore's desk, her hands folded in her lap, her mind racing through possibilities. Had she made a terrible mistake? Would she be accused of theft for taking the letters? Would anyone believe that her intentions had been good? When Whitmore returned, his face had taken on a grim seriousness she had never seen before. He sat down heavily and looked at her for a long moment before speaking. "You did the right thing bringing this to me," he said carefully. "But from this moment forward, you are to speak of it to no one. Do you understand? Not your colleagues, not your friends, not even your mother." Peggy nodded, though confusion swirled through her mind. "Return to your normal duties," Whitmore continued. "Pretend this conversation never happened. Some people will be coming to speak with you later today. Answer their questions honestly and completely. Beyond that, say nothing to anyone." He paused, his weathered face serious. "This is important, Miss Thornton, more important than you realize." The paradox settled over Peggy like a weight. She had expected validation or dismissal, praise or punishment. Instead, she had received secrecy. Her silly idea about misprinted stamps had been transformed by a single telephone call into something that required silence, caution, and visitors from London. This was not a printing error. This was not her imagination. This was real, and it was dangerous. The rest of the morning passed in a blur. Peggy returned to her sorting station. She moved letters from bag to slot to bag. Dorothy chatted about her sister's garden and the difficulty of finding sugar for tea. The other workers complained about sore feet and discussed plans for the weekend. Peggy heard their voices as if from a great distance. Her hands performed their tasks automatically, while her mind spun with questions and fears. The 5 envelopes now sat somewhere in Whitmore's locked office, evidence of something she still did not fully understand. And somewhere in London, people were making decisions about what to do next. What those decisions might be, Peggy could only guess. The people who arrived that afternoon were not what Peggy had expected. She had imagined policemen in uniform, perhaps, or military officials with medals pinned to their chests and stern expressions carved into their faces. Instead, 3 individuals in civilian clothes appeared at the sorting facility just after 4 o'clock, precisely as Peggy's shift was ending. There were 2 men and 1 woman, all appearing to be in their 30s. They wore ordinary clothes, wool coats, simple hats, practical shoes. Their faces were unremarkable, the kind of faces designed to be forgotten the moment you looked away. They could have been shopkeepers, teachers, or office workers. Nothing about them suggested authority or power. Yet the moment they stepped into the building, the atmosphere changed. Whitmore emerged from his office immediately, spoke to them in hushed tones, then gestured toward Peggy. The woman approached first. She had brown hair pulled back in a practical bun. She wore a tweed suit that could have belonged to any secretary or schoolteacher in England. When she spoke, her accent was crisp and educated, the voice of someone accustomed to being listened to. "Miss Thornton," she said with a slight smile that did not reach her eyes. "My name is Miss Crawford. We would like to discuss your observations in more detail. Would you accompany us to a more private location?" It was phrased as a question, but Peggy understood it was not really optional. "Yes, of course," Peggy said. They drove in silence through the foggy streets of Falmouth. The car was black and unremarkable. One of the men drove while Miss Crawford sat beside Peggy in the back seat. No one spoke. The only sounds were the engine's rumble and the soft swish of tires on wet pavement. They arrived at a building on the outskirts of town. It was a former warehouse, Peggy guessed, that had been converted into offices. The exterior showed no signs or markings to indicate its purpose. The windows on the upper floor were covered from the inside, blocking any view of what happened within. Inside, Peggy was led through a corridor of closed doors. The walls were painted a dull beige. The floor was bare concrete. The air smelled of disinfectant and damp stone. Finally, they reached a small room furnished with a table, 4 chairs, and nothing else. The walls here were institutional green. A single window was covered with heavy blackout curtains despite it being only late afternoon. Miss Crawford sat across from Peggy. The 2 men took positions by the door and window respectively. Their faces remained carefully neutral, revealing nothing. "Start from the beginning," Miss Crawford said. Her voice was calm and professional, completely without judgment. "Tell us everything you observed. Leave out no detail, no matter how insignificant it may seem." Peggy talked for nearly 2 hours. Her throat grew dry, but no one offered her water. She described each of the 5 letters in detail. She explained the subtle differences in the stamps, the fractionally off-center profile, the different spacing of perforations, the shade of ink that was just slightly too dark. She showed them her notebook, which they examined with intense interest, passing it between them and making their own notes. She told them about her conversation with her mother, about what her grandmother had said regarding counterfeit stamps during the previous war. She even described her own thought process, the way her mind worked to notice patterns that others missed. When she finished, Miss Crawford leaned back in her chair. The room fell silent, except for the distant sound of traffic outside. Then she said something completely unexpected. "You have a remarkable gift for observation, Miss Thornton. What you have stumbled upon is indeed significant, and we need your help to uncover more." Peggy blinked. "More? What do you mean?" Miss Crawford's expression remained neutral. "The 5 letters you identified are part of a communication network that British intelligence has been trying to penetrate for months. The counterfeit stamps are produced by a foreign intelligence service. They are used to mark certain letters for special attention by operatives embedded in the postal system in other parts of the country. The words hung in the air like smoke. Peggy struggled to process what she was hearing. Miss Crawford continued, "By studying the letters you intercepted, our analysts have already begun to decode the system being used, but we need more letters, more examples, more data to fully understand the network structure. And we need someone with your unusual ability to spot the subtle differences in the stamps to help us identify which letters are part of this system." Peggy felt as though the floor had tilted beneath her chair. "Are you asking me to become some kind of spy?" The idea seemed absurd. She was 17 years old, a postal clerk, a girl who still lived with her mother and had never been farther from home than Plymouth. Miss Crawford smiled slightly. "We are not asking you to become a field agent or to take any physical risks. We are simply asking you to continue doing exactly what you have been doing, but more systematically. We will provide you with magnifying equipment and training in what to look for. You will continue working at the postal facility, performing your normal duties, but you will also screen all incoming mail for the distinctive counterfeit stamps. Any letters you flag will be quietly intercepted and analyzed." The paradox was almost laughable. Britain's intelligence services, with all their training and technology and professional expertise, needed a teenage girl who noticed things. They were asking her, a nobody from a foggy coastal town, to help them fight a hidden war. Peggy thought about her father somewhere at sea, facing dangers she could not imagine. She thought about the darkness spreading across the world. She thought about what it meant to say no when you had been given a chance to help. "I will do it," she said quietly. Over the following weeks, Peggy received training unlike anything she had imagined possible. Miss Crawford and her colleagues taught her about the technical details of stamp production, information that transformed what had been instinct into systematic knowledge. She learned about printing techniques used to produce stamps around the world, lithography, where images are transferred from stone or metal plates, engraving, where designs are cut directly into metal surfaces. Each method left distinctive marks, tiny signatures of the production process itself. She was shown examples of forgeries from various countries, German forgeries of British stamps, British forgeries of German stamps, counterfeits produced during the previous war, and newer ones created for this conflict. Each forgery had tells, small imperfections that betrayed its false origin. Miss Crawford explained that even the most skilled forgers could not perfectly replicate the micro-variations in genuine stamps. Real stamps are produced with precision machinery calibrated to exact specifications, she said, holding a genuine stamp up to the light. Forgers work from photographs and stolen samples. They can come close, remarkably close, but there are always tiny irregularities in the printing process that are nearly impossible to reproduce. Peggy learned to recognize these irregularities. The slight blurring at the edge of a letter where ink had spread fractionally too far. The microscopic misalignment of colors in stamps that used multiple printing passes. The texture of paper stock that was almost but not quite identical to the genuine article. She was provided with tools that became extensions of her natural abilities. A high-quality magnifying glass disguised as a reading aid, the sort an older person with failing eyesight might use. She kept it at her sorting station where it appeared completely ordinary. She also received a small ultraviolet lamp that could reveal invisible markings, inks that appeared normal under regular light but glowed under UV exposure, and a chemical solution in a tiny bottle that could detect certain types of ink used by foreign intelligence services. But perhaps the most difficult part of her training had nothing to do with technical knowledge or equipment. She had to learn to control her reactions, to appear completely normal, even when she spotted something significant. Your natural instinct when you notice something interesting is to examine it closely, Miss Crawford told her during one session, to turn it over in your hands, to share your discovery with others. You must suppress these impulses entirely. Glance casually at a suspicious letter, set it aside without drawing attention, Wait until the end of your shift to report your findings through the secure channel we have established. Peggy practiced this repeatedly, looking without appearing to look, noticing without reacting. It felt unnatural, like holding her breath underwater, but she mastered it because the work demanded it. The results were immediate and striking. Within the first month of systematic screening, Peggy identified 23 additional letters bearing the counterfeit stamps, 23 letters in 4 weeks. The network was larger and more active than anyone had suspected. Analysis of these letters revealed something that sent a chill through British intelligence circles. The letters appeared completely innocent on the surface. They discussed mundane topics that would raise no suspicion if read by a postal censor. A letter from a supposed aunt talked about family health and the difficulty of finding fresh vegetables. Another discussed the weather and how cold the autumn had been. A third mentioned the price of coal and wool and how expensive everything had become. Ordinary conversation, the kind of thing written in thousands of letters every day across Britain. But certain words and phrases served as signals. Aunt Mary is feeling better meant naval vessels had been spotted in a particular area. The weather has been cold and wet indicated increased military activity. Coal is scarce this month, referred to supply convoys and their schedules. The letters conveyed detailed information about military movements, shipping schedules, and defensive preparations along the coast, information that could get men killed if it reached enemy hands. The paradox was chilling. The most dangerous secrets were hidden in the most boring sentences. While dramatic, coded messages might attract attention, these letters passed unnoticed through the postal system every day, looking exactly like the worried correspondence of ordinary people trying to maintain family connections during difficult times. Peggy sat at her sorting station each day, the smell of damp paper and ink filling her lungs, the sound of her colleagues chatting about ration books and garden vegetables washing over her. She looked exactly like what she was, a teenage clerk doing routine work. No one watching her would have suspected that she was identifying enemy communications with every shift, that her casual glances were actually systematic intelligence screening. Dorothy Finch continued to work beside her, oblivious. "You have been very quiet lately," Dorothy remarked one afternoon. "Are you feeling well, dear?" "Just tired," Peggy replied with a smile. "My mother has had me helping at the hospital in the evenings." It was a lie, but a necessary one. The truth that she was helping dismantle a German spy network could not be spoken aloud. Each flagged letter was quietly removed from the mail stream and delivered to Miss Crawford's team. Each one added another piece to the puzzle of how the network operated, who was involved, and what information they were gathering. But the biggest discovery was still ahead, and it would come from a letter that carried not just a counterfeit stamp, but a hidden mark that changed everything. In early November, Peggy made the discovery that would break the network wide open. A letter addressed to Mr. Thomas Hartley in the village of Constantine bore the familiar counterfeit stamp. But this time there was something more. As Peggy held the envelope up to the light from the window, she noticed a faint pattern embedded in the paper itself. A watermark, small, geometric, barely visible unless you knew exactly how to position the paper and where to look. She had never seen this marking before on any of the previous letters. Her pulse quickened, but her face remained calm. She set the letter aside with the same casual gesture she had practiced 100 times. No reaction. No visible interest, just another piece of mail moving through the sorting process. That evening, she reported the watermark through the secure channel Miss Crawford had established. The response was immediate. Miss Crawford herself arrived in Falmouth the following day, accompanied by additional analysts. Peggy sensed a heightened level of urgency she had not felt before. "The watermark is a priority marker," Miss Crawford explained in their usual meeting room, her voice tight with controlled tension. "It indicates that the letter contains information of particular importance, information that needs to reach its intended recipient quickly and without interference." Analysis of the letter's contents revealed specific details about upcoming convoy movements, through the western approaches, the waters between Britain and the Atlantic, the dates, the routes, the number of vessels. If this information reached German naval commanders, U-boats could be positioned to intercept. Ships would be sunk. Men would die. Miss Crawford's face was grave. The letter cannot be allowed to reach its recipient in its current form, but we also cannot simply intercept it without alerting the network that their communications have been compromised. We need a more delicate solution. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. The letter would be delivered as usual, but first, the envelope would be carefully opened using steam and specialized tools. The contents would be replaced with modified text that preserved the surface meaning while altering the critical details. The convoy route would be changed by several degrees. The timing would be shifted by a day. The number of vessels would be incorrect. And then the letter would be resealed so carefully that no one could detect it had been tampered with, and delivered to Mr. Thomas Hartley as if nothing had happened. Peggy played a crucial role in this operation. She marked the letter for special handling through a system of subtle pencil marks invisible to anyone not trained to see them. She ensured it was diverted to the intelligence team, and 48 hours later she reintroduced the modified letter into the normal mail stream in a way that would raise no suspicion. The modified letter was delivered on November 15th. On November 22nd, a convoy departed from a British port. It took a route that differed significantly from the one described in the false intelligence. Meanwhile, a German U-boat patrol positioned itself based on the misinformation, waiting in empty ocean where they expected to encounter merchant vessels. The convoy arrived safely at its destination. The U-boats found nothing. More importantly, the failed interception allowed British intelligence to track how quickly the false information had moved through the network. By measuring the response time, analysts estimated the number of intermediaries involved and the likely locations of key operatives. The network was being mapped from the inside, using its own communication system against itself. The paradox was complete. Germany's most sophisticated intelligence network on British soil was being dismantled not by force or violence, but by a teenage girl with sharp eyes and a few carefully altered letters. In March 1943, the trap closed. In coordinated operations across southern England, intelligence services moved simultaneously against 11 individuals identified as participants in the espionage network. The operations were conducted quietly, without public announcement. Among those detained was Thomas Hartley, the man who had received the watermarked letter. He was not a foreign agent, but a British citizen recruited years earlier through ideological sympathy and financial pressure. Under questioning, he revealed the names of his contacts and the methods by which information flowed through the network. Also captured was a woman named Ingrid Carlson. She had been living in Britain under a false identity for nearly 3 years, posing as a Swedish refugee. She worked as a translator for a shipping company, a position that gave her access to cargo movements and port activities. She was the one coordinating the distribution of counterfeit stamps, receiving supplies from abroad, and passing them to the network's couriers. Intelligence analysts later estimated that Peggy's observations had accelerated the dismantling of the network by at least 6 months. Without her contribution, the counterfeit stamp system might have continued operating undetected, allowing valuable intelligence to flow to German forces and potentially contributing to significant Allied losses. In the summer of 1943, Miss Crawford visited Peggy's cottage one warm July evening. She offered Peggy a formal position with British intelligence, proper training, a government salary, a chance to apply her talents to broader challenges. Peggy considered it carefully, then declined. She wanted to continue her education, perhaps attend university after the war ended. She had discovered that she loved learning and wanted to pursue that in an academic setting rather than an intelligence one. Miss Crawford accepted her decision graciously. From a small leather case, she produced a bronze medal on a ribbon. "This is unofficial," she said, "not something you can wear publicly or have recorded, but it is genuine appreciation from those who understand what you accomplished." The medal bore a small geometric design, the same pattern Peggy had discovered in the watermarked letter. Peggy kept it hidden in a wooden box. She never spoke publicly about her wartime role, honoring the secrecy that had been asked of her. After the war ended, Peggy pursued her educational ambitions. She enrolled at university and studied visual perception and cognitive psychology, fields that allowed her to understand scientifically what she had experienced intuitively. She earned her doctorate in 1952 and spent 4 decades as a researcher and teacher, contributing to fields as diverse as quality control in manufacturing, forensic document analysis, and medical diagnostic training. The full story of her wartime contribution emerged only after intelligence documents were declassified decades later. By then, Peggy had passed away at age 84, having lived a full and quiet life. She had come to the postal facility as an ordinary clerk. She left as the girl who saw what trained experts had missed. 11 operatives were captured not through surveillance networks or radio interception, but because one teenager refused to believe that all stamps looked the same. In the end, Britain's hidden war was won not only with codes and commandos, but with attention, curiosity, and the courage to say that something seemed not quite right. And that perception, clear-eyed and unclouded by assumption, proved as powerful as any weapon in the arsenal.